I know you well enough that you would go without food so your children could eat, right? If push came to shove that way, right? And that's really what I'm saying. It's like, if you understand that we're all in this together, right? I think about the Haudenosaunee people, the Six Nations, right? And the Great Law of Peace, that we need to have a 700 plus year plan.
All right, Rising Man family. I've got Chief Phillip Scott joining us here again today. This is the fourth time that we've had you here on the show. Now, I was looking back at our notes, and we've done this. I think it spans over almost 2 years now, because we were talking about the pandemic in one of our earlier episodes. So, kind of cool to be here now and see what kind of wisdom you have to share today. So, thanks for taking some time, Chief, and always good to jam with you.
It's a pleasure always to be with you. I really love you and support the work that you're doing out in the world to serve men and humanity.
Likewise. Well, let's get rolling, because I know you've got so much to say on the topics we brought here today. And one of the first places I want to begin is something I know that you spoke about recently at an event you attended that you were asked to come and facilitate, present. And you mentioned this term, the catastrophes of society. I just want to break that down for a second, because even that's an interesting combination of words. So when we talk about catastrophes in society, what does that mean, and what are you speaking to?
Well, when I track what's transpiring in the world, I notice some very significant motifs that are emerging, and there's an interconnectivity between all of them, right? So we cannot deny our impact as human beings on this earth. Right. And the earth is warming. And as a consequence, we see these changes, which have been prophesized by Indigenous people for millennia. But the reality is that the earth is warming. And as a consequence of our actions, we are directly impacting her. And so we see, for example, here within California, the wildfires that are raging here, the wildfires raging in Australia. We see the bleaching of the corals, right, in various parts of the world, and the significant weather phenomena as a consequence of our direct impact. And the reality is that our Earth, she's becoming inflamed, right? That there is a rise in temperature. And if we see the analogy within ourselves, what happens? We call that a fever, right? An inflammation. And so our earth is becoming inflamed. And as a consequence of this inflammation, she is endeavoring to self-regulate, which is also what the human body and the human organism also does when we have a fever, right? There's a mechanism for attempting to cool it down internally, but oftentimes we have to rely upon external sources. And those external sources are cool packs, for example, in different parts of the body. And depending upon the extremity of that, we can move into a state of death as a result of too much heat inside the body, right? Hyperthermia, as it's called, right? Mm-hmm. And so that can be quite deleterious to the human organism. Well, again, we have both scientists who are corroborating Indigenous wisdom and knowledge, saying, listen, it becomes unsustainable if we continue to allow these global temperatures to rise based upon our human unsustainable trajectory in our impact, right? Mm-hmm. So she's regulating herself. And as a consequence, we're seeing these fires that are emerging. But we're also seeing fires emerging in other ways, an escalation, if you will, of the wars, aggression, and violence that is occurring in our world. And for me, that's a direct result of this inflammation that's happening on the earth because we are connected to her directly.
Yeah. Well, I 100% agree with the analysis that you're giving, especially there towards the end where you're pulling in these other extremities of the core issue that the planet heating up causes. There's these consequences. There's a sequence of events that occur as a result of a ripple that happens from the source of the planet heating up. And I remember it made me think, when you were talking about inflammation and using that as a metaphor, it made me think of this poem I wrote back when I was in my mid-20s traveling around, and this idea of Mother Earth going through menopause happened. And, like that, the transformation, that a significant change, and obviously using the comparison between the planet as a feminine female being going through this significant temperature or homeostatic shift. And I remember when I was a kid, I was just thinking about this a little bit more. When I was a kid and I started to see and experience my mom going through menopause, I remember it would be winter and she would just have these spells where her body would just heat up and there was nothing she could do. And she would go and just stand out in the sub-zero temperatures of winter in the Northeast. And I'd be like, what are you doing? You're crazy, Mom. She's like, I'm just trying to cool down. And so it also makes me think of, to keep rolling with that metaphor, that I remember when my mom would go through menopause, it wasn't just her temperature. It was also hormonal. It was emotional. There was mental challenges, all the types of things that she went through that I think a lot of women go through. Also an under discussed topic. So that's sidebar, right? But it reminds me of the way that myself, my brothers, my dad, and everyone around her would respond or react to her in those times. And there were responses that could be supportive, right? Just accepting and loving her and doing our best to understand where she was and trying to support her as she was going through this huge change on a biological, physical, mental, emotional level. And there was also times where I know for myself, I'll speak for myself, I won't speak for my family, but I definitely didn't show up as my best in support of my mom during those times. So again, the parallel between those metaphors of menopause and how this applies to the planet changing, there's so many ripples out from that one core event that you're discussing. And I think about the difference between how people respond or react during overwhelming worldly events. And we're starting to see these things happen, especially the mass shootings, right? And all the other things that have been happening as well. So speaking to that, let's talk about the ripples, the impacts that come from this greater central event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, just to honor your mother, right? So there was this impulse for her, as you know, in her time of menopause, in that shift into the next phase of the feminine journey, right? She had this heating up, and she had the natural inclination and impulse to cool herself down by standing outside in winter, right? And in the snow. And though it seemed crazy to yourself and your brothers and your father, right, it was something that she did instinctively, right, in order to cool herself down. And you know, the earth is doing that as well through her own self-regulating mechanism. But it's also our responsibility as a species. You know, you talked about the reactions to this. And so there are still people that are attempting to deny the reality of what's happening globally in terms of the rise in temperatures. And for us, this is very dangerous because we have to really begin collectively to endeavor to shift our actions so that there can be the cooling of the planet as well. Because we've been directly impacting her, our actions therefore have to reflect a different relationship, right? And that means also and to answer your question, I'm going to tie this in here a little bit. For me, this has to do with the denigration of the feminine. Okay, we often will regard with Indigenous cultures that we see the earth as a living entity who is our mother, right? So there's a regard about Gaia and Mother Earth, right? And so if there is a culture of the denigration and the suppression and oppression of women, then that in and of itself is going to place a disregard and disrespect upon the mother. And that's what we're seeing now with the pollution and the ravaging of her. Right?
Yeah.
And that is the, essentially, that's the, shall we say, unhealthy patriarchy, right? And of course, when I talk about the patriarchy, that's a collective dream. It's not just gender specific, right? And so it's all of our species that are essentially not taking a balanced approach to understanding the world, right? And so in terms of this reflection, we see this playing out in the violence, as you mentioned, in terms of the mass shootings, right? That's the escalation for me of this inflammation, of the aggression and the violence that's happening in the world from this inflammation. And of course, we see this occurring in the wars that are being waged elsewhere, not just only in Ukraine, but in Somalia, in Syria, in Yemen, in different parts of Africa now, in Mozambique, return to Somalia. And of course, it's still occurring in Afghanistan. So we have all these wars that are being waged, right? And generally, it's under the guise of an antiquated paradigm of conquest. Right? This is where we have to understand that as a species, we have to begin to embrace a different way of being in the world. And so, for example, what transpired in Ukraine for me is a direct reflection of also what happened here in Turtle Island in North America. Right? You had colonizers coming in from the outside, and in the name of manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery, what did they do? They swept west and they began to exterminate anyone or anything that stood in their way in the acquisition of land and resources. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that exact same scenario playing itself out in Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the correlation by seeing that this is an antiquated paradigm of colonization, right? That really needs to be addressed globally and eliminated, because the countless suffering that's occurring, the unnecessary deaths, as well as these horrific shootings that are happening in the United States, and all of the rhetoric that is trying to obfuscate, trying to really move away from what the real essence of the issue is, which is essentially eliminating the access to weapons that are really unnecessary for civilians to be carrying.
Yeah. Well, you make so many great points there. I've got a few things I want to say in response to that. Number one is, again, continuing on with the metaphor we have here of a planet being inflamed, or a woman, a Mother Earth going through menopause. There's the obvious events that we can all point to, and I think many of us would all get on the same side of when it comes to extreme violence, especially violence towards women. These things that fall on that end of the spectrum, where it's really difficult to challenge that. It's hard to defend acts of that nature. For me, especially when in this conversation of what it means to be a man, what it means to be of service to a community, to a family, to our planet, in the way that men are capable of, in a masculine way, to me is about how can I make my actions more congruent with pure service, not service with an agenda, not service with an et cetera or an asterisk or something else attached to it. And I think this is the more subtle piece that most of the people who listen to this podcast are probably going to be able to benefit from, because let's just use climate change as an example, right? I think there's many people, probably most people who listen to this podcast are going to be on the same side of, hey, the climate is changing. Yes, we need to do some things to make this better. I love solar power. I'm all for electric vehicles. But at some point, every single one of us, or at least say many of us, I won't make a broad stroke, but many of us have a limit to where we're willing to compromise our wants and desires. How far am I willing to compromise myself, what I want, what I feel like I need, whether it's my biological instincts or impulses or just my egoic desires, in favor of something bigger, something that's bigger than just me. For example, I'm all for save the planet. I'm all for solar power. And then people are still driving around gas guzzling vehicles. It's like, well, how is that congruent with the other things that you said? Well, I still need to get around. It's like, okay, well, we all have a desire for comfort. And I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on just comfort and the pursuit of comfort as humans, because I think that's also playing into this, where I'm willing to compromise my comfort to a degree, but all of us have a limit to where we will do that. And oftentimes that's where the push needs to happen. How uncomfortable am I willing to get in service to or in favor of a future that I may never get to see?
Yeah. Well, so that's probably a dangerous question to ask myself, because a person who's a Sundance leader, I'm willing to make sacrifices and be uncomfortable, right, for the people. But what we're really talking about is a shift in definition, okay, away from the illusion of Western freedom, which is essentially tantamount to, I'm going to do whatever I want to do whenever I want to do it. That's basically the definition of freedom in the Western colonized world. But from an Indigenous perspective, that's not freedom, that's selfishness. Right? So the whole mask issue, for example, right, in terms of that sovereignty, right? In Native country, when the children went back to school on the res, and they also implemented a mask mandate, there was no contention because they wanted to safeguard their elders. Right? In fact, the res was actually asking for PPE, asking for assistance, and so myself and the institute arranged for PPE rather to be disseminated to different reservations because they wanted to safeguard their elders. In fact, they had on the Pine Ridge Reservation, they had armed warriors saying, "You cannot enter into our territory here because we will make sure that our people are safe." So it's a different understanding of freedom, which is based upon interconnectivity and interrelationship, not selfishness, right? And, of course, most of the listeners are going to say, yeah, I'm on board with global support and making sure that we minimize our impact, and even as you mentioned about the sovereignty of women's rights. But yet right now in the Supreme Court of the United States, right, those rights that we think are, should be standard are being put into question, right? And so a woman's physical autonomy, right, is now subject for debate by basically men, right? So, we do have this ongoing conflict and issue regarding this. Whereas if there is an understanding of freedom, which is based upon absence of concern for yourself rather than a self-absorption, right? If we really are understanding our interrelationship and interconnection, then I'm willing to make sacrifices so that the whole would be able to flourish, right? Mm-hmm. And all make those adjustments, right? Because that's how the earth is also going to cool, by us all collectively working together to minimize our impact. And that requires that level of reverence and respect and connection and cooperation and solidarity.
Yes. I want to highlight that last piece you got to, the absence of concern for yourself, because I would say that is a colonized mindset. Right? That is a very colonial mentality. I think that's very embedded in Western philosophy. Going back to what I said about comfort, I think I like what you said about absence of concern for self, because I think that's really the contrasting point there. And for me, that is always something that needs to be modeled. I don't think, certainly I know this because I have children, that children don't arrive into this world instinctively absent of concern for themselves. In fact, as children, that's their job, is to be concerned for themselves and to scream out when they're hungry and to let the adults and their protectors and guardians know when they need something. But it's the shift from that natural, instinctual childhood mentality into more of this adult mentality that often fails to happen. And why I myself am so passionate about rites of passage and initiatory models that are reintroducing a model for exactly what you said, the ultimate, the sacrifice on behalf of the community and the family, on behalf of future generations that we may never see. That's how do we shift into that? Because to me, that's the root of this type of conversation.
Well, as you have been obviously embodying in your own life, as well as your mission and purpose with the men that you serve, is rites of passage and ceremony, right? Because at the heart of that is an awareness of selflessness, right? To be able to sacrifice, to take on, to fast without food and water and sleep, say in a traditional hamblecha, right? Or to sundance, right? To literally sacrifice your flesh and your blood for the benefit of other people, right? For the world. And so we're actually taking on privation and sacrifice. And I don't use the word suffering. We're not suffering because it's volitional. It's a choice. And so it's more about how we can, as a father, you obviously are willing to endure discomfort, right? You would, if we found ourselves in a situation of privation, right? I would imagine, and I know you well enough, that you would go without food so your children could eat, right? If push came to shove that way, right? And that's really what I'm saying. It's like, if you understand that we're all in this together, right? I think about the Haudenosaunee people, the Six Nations, right? And the Great Law of Peace, that we need to have a 700 plus year plan, right? That we are cognizant that our actions and our words impact 7 generations forward and backward, right? And so, yes, we're not going to see the future generations. We may see our children or our grandchildren, maybe even great grandchildren if we're fortunate. And yet, there is a lineage, there is a continuity of life beyond ourselves. And so, are we going to foster that so that all life on this planet can flourish? Or are we going to continue to be self-absorbed and think only, of our own needs and desires and wants?
Yeah. Well, I'll speak for myself and my own experience. That's certainly something that I feel very fortunate, and I use the word fortunate very deliberately, because I know that my path and my experience and who I've gotten to spend time around, who I've gotten to learn from, is not the normal experience, not what most people get to have. And that's obviously why it's so important for me to create other invitations for more people to enter into it. Because had I not had people to model this for me, had I not had elders, had I not had uncles and aunties and people who I met along my journey, then I don't think I would be any different than folks out there who are still wandering and looking for something. In fact, and this is actually a good segue into something else I wanted to speak with you about. I remember clearly and I've shared this story many times on the podcast before. I know I've shared it with you. My impulse and my motivation for leaving the East Coast originally was because I was so lost. I had so many of the surface level boxes checked off in my life: job, income, community, family nearby. All of that was taken care of, but I just had no clue what I was supposed to do as a man. This is like my early mid 20s. And I remember when I started to have what I think of as my personal awakening and my own rite of passage into figuring out who I am and what I'm here to do, I started to feel what now I look back on and say it was my ego coming online, my ego that was craving significance, that genuinely, because in my heart, I just wanted to be of service. I just wanted to help. I just wanted to do my part in making the world a better place. And up until that moment, I had no idea how to do that. There was nobody showing me the way there. It was a very conventional model that was handed to me: go to school, get a degree, get a job, help people, and raise a small family. But I knew that there was more than just that. And when I started to feel that coming online and I saw these possibilities, my ego was ready to run wild. I had the same thoughts I'm sure a lot of people do, like, oh, I can go and I can go to the jungles and study with medicine people and then bring that back to the United States and, serve medicine to people, which I know is something that I know for you, especially, you carry a lot of vigilance around, because, and maybe this is a distinction, I'd like to hear you weigh in on it. I think making the distinction between intentionality and wanting to do good and to bring goodness into the world, and then I use the word ignorance, but very carefully, not knowing better or not understanding the gravity of these lineages and the depth and the reverence that's needed. So I kind of serving up a softball for you, because I know this is something you care deeply about, but I just want to open that up, because I know there's a lot of people who will listen and they have really good intentions and motivations, but without the guidance or the modeling for them.
Yeah. So, again, going back to a more colonized and often appropriative model, there's, for me, I make a very clear distinction between sacraments, which are sacred plant medicines, as well as the fungi that are also ubiquitous in ceremonies throughout indigenous cultures around the world, and psychedelics and entheogens, right? And so for me, unfortunately, the words psychedelic and entheogen are interchangeable. And for me, this is an affront and a disrespect to the sacred plant medicines and these sacred fungi that have thousands and thousands of years of lineage, right? So for me, psychedelics and entheogen is a Western colonized descriptor, right? And my preference is that we employ the word sacraments when it comes to these holy medicines that have been around for millennia, as well as the fungi. And with that is the ceremonial reverence and respect that has been cultivated also for millennia with indigenous cultures, right? Because often what happens is that people that are taking these sacraments, but outside the context of ceremony, there is no container, right? And so it's disrespectful of the sacred plant medicine as well as the indigenous people and the struggle that they endured. I mean, literally, people have died to ensure that these ceremonies could be preserved for future generations within their own traditions and their own lineages and cultures. Mm-hmm. And this is often overlooked, or the other counterpart is that there are individuals who are not qualified to conduct these ceremonies, right? Maybe they have an experience down in South America for a couple of weeks with grandmother Aya, okay? And then they come back and they think that they are somehow now qualified to be able to administer these sacred plant medicines, right? And of course, within the Native American church, the elaborate protocols ceremonially, the songs, the procedures, all of which are require years and years of training and apprenticeship to be potentially granted permission to receive a fireplace and therefore to administer this medicine in a sacred manner.
Yeah.
And
I don't know why this just dawned on me, but for some reason it just popped into my head. You don't see anybody out there going to mass for the first time in a Catholic church and then saying, "Oh my God, I want to be a priest," and then presuming that they're able to. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone who it seems funny to think about that when it comes to, and maybe it's a matter of regulation and exposure. I think a lot of people have not had exposure to traditional, and when I say traditional, I mean really traditional ceremonial lineages that have gone on for generations and generations. And so I think when it comes to something where Catholicism, for example, has been so in the forefront and so many people have witnessed and experienced those ceremonies and practices that they're like, oh, I would never think of assuming that I could be a priest. But because there's this ancient technology that is coming out of the jungle that I'm seeing for the first time, that's not, I guess the word regulated comes to mind. Maybe there's a better term. I know you're a lot better with words than I am.
Well, the analogy that I use, because it's also, indigenous ceremonial practices are medicine ways. Right? The analogy I usually prefer, but the one about Catholicism is equally valid and true. Within the Western colonized world, we have allopathic medicine, modern medicine. And essentially to become a medical doctor, it requires around 10 years of training. You've got your schooling for 4 years, you've got your residencies, your rotations. So around 10, 12 years, maybe you'll become, a qualified medical doctor. Well, no one in the Western world would ever be presumptuous enough to call themselves a medical doctor if they haven't gone through that medical training. I am also, in addition to, one who practices, ceremonial medicine and traditional healing, I'm also an EMT. I've been trained in emergency medicine. Well, it's actually against the law for me to practice beyond my scope. Right? I could lose my license. I could be incarcerated if I even practice the scope of a nurse, for example. Okay, so there are restrictions on what I am by law qualified to perform. And yet, when it comes to indigenous medicine ways, there isn't that same level of respect, because I think at the heart of the matter is this appropriative model. So they don't understand, and we talked about ignorance, right? And for me, and the root of the word ignorance is to ignore, right? To ignore the truth, right? And so an individual can participate in a traditional purification laws or set up in the Native American church, and then somehow think, they don't understand the degree of devotion and mastery and apprenticeship that's required to be able to administer these medicines in a safe way, right? And so, in all of my travels around the world, speaking with other chiefs and medicine people, they say it requires 10 years of apprenticeship to become a bona fide traditional medicine practitioner. And again, we're talking about literal blood, sweat, and tears in this case. And so, I always encourage people in the West who have this impulse to want to go to the jungle and learn with the traditional medicine people there to have turtle medicine. Got to slow way down. take your time, because there's so much to learn and absorb in terms of the specific songs and protocols and procedures and nuances and subtleties that can only be gleaned over years of association and discipline.
Yeah, I like that. And I've heard you say that many times before, and I agree with it as well. Again, I'll be the first to admit that I have experienced in the past I guess what I would call it is the impulse to move quickly towards something. And the story I was telling myself was there's no time to waste. People need this now. And so obviously what I've learned is that it's not really my responsibility to accelerate my learning so that I can provide something to other people. There's already folks out there like yourself and other people who I've sat with and studied with and learned from who are already doing this. And if it's really a matter of you want to make an impact and make a difference and create greater access and really help people to heal, then I think it's important to ask ourselves the question, what is my role right now? What is my role right now? Because some people are just bridges. I know many people who have no interest in serving medicine in this way or conducting ceremonies, but are more than happy to bring people along and say, hey, you need to meet Chief Phillip Scott, or you need to meet these other medicine practitioners out there. Yeah. That's a really important role to play, because not everybody knows how to access some of those people. So I guess that's the thing I encourage people to do is ask yourself, if you are feeling this compulsion that we're describing here, and for myself, not harboring any judgment, but just ask yourself the question, what is the rush? What is what is the urgency that with which you're telling yourself or believing that things need to move faster, or you need to accelerate this? What is that urgency actually coming from? And really trying to get to the bottom of it, because I know for myself, and I know what I presume to have to exist in other people, is there is some egoic attachment to significance and authority and positions of power and influence that are attached to it. And in my opinion, that taints the potential of the medicine, and it interferes and gets in the way of what the medicine is actually going to do.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, so the other thing that's important is, like, these ceremonies are not experiences, they're a way of life. If it is your way of life, you're willing to slow down. You're willing to take your time, because you know that you have the time, because you create the time for the things that are important to you. So if this is your way of life, you're actually not going to short circuit the learning and the teaching, because as a consequence, you're going to have significant gaps in your knowledge. And those gaps in your knowledge are what's going to harm yourself and your family, as well as the other people that you are endeavoring to serve. Like, we live in a culture that loves shortcuts. And what the problem with shortcuts is that people are going to get hurt. And the word that we use in the West, in the allopathic paradigm, is negligence, right? So if you are not qualified, if you haven't really gained all of the knowledge and the mastery necessary as a foundation from which to begin, then you are actually potentially harming yourself and others. And that's tantamount to negligence. And I mean, I reside in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so I do a lot of damage control here. There's a lot of so-called shamans out there and people who think they're qualified but aren't. And as a consequence, they do more harm than good. And so the other thing is you have to cultivate patience so you don't become a patient or create other patients, right? So we literally have to learn how to, and that's mastery in any endeavor, really. I mean, if you want to become a martial artist, if you want to become a black belt in any of the martial arts, you're looking at also about 10 years of apprenticeship to move through the echelons of mastery and responsibility and praxis, right? And so why we would think that in such a sophisticated ancient medicine way that have been around for thousands of years, how we think that we can, just kind of pop in as an observer, experience something and take something away, and then exercise that in the world, I think is very dangerous, actually.
Well, and it brings me all the way back full circle to where we started this conversation, because I believe that's where a lot of the urgency ultimately stems from, is the rapidly changing environment around us. I mean, that just looking at the accelerated evolution and change and transformation that's happening on a cultural level, on a climate level, on a financial level, socially, it's like it's getting faster every single year. And I see it in my children. I see my children that seem to be growing up in all of the ways faster than I remember growing up. And of course, I had a different perspective of my own growing up process. But I believe that there's a connection between that urgency that we all feel on every level and how that plays into the way we look at solutions, or the way that we look at how I can have an impact. So what do you say to somebody who's feeling the urgency on the planet, who's feeling, hey, Chief, we don't really have a lot of time here. It looks like that we got to start taking some action yesterday, and then starting and negotiating these urgent tendencies when it comes to how we approach what we really think will make an impact?
Well, I think the motivation piece is really key, right? Is this urgency based upon you wanting to draw attention to yourself, right? Again, we live in a culture where, you have your Instagram page and you have this, and, you're basically trying to show the world that you are important and that you have something to share. And I'm not saying that should be negated, right? But I still believe that it needs to be tempered a little bit, right? There is an urgency, but the urgency is not for one individual alone. But the urgency has to do with the survivability of this planet and all life upon her. So for me, it is, we have to transcend the rhetoric now, right? This is, for me, for us to work collectively to achieve solutions to mitigate the rising temperatures, right? So it's not just about, politics and punditry. It really is about people and seeing how we're going to be able to survive. I mean, it's the same rhetoric around, the elimination of guns, because it threatens the Second Amendment, right? Versus saying, is it really necessary for a 13-year-old to be carrying an assault rifle? I mean, there's got to be a pragmatic conversation here and a realistic one, okay? And so how can we collectively come together and not continue to obfuscate and deny what's really happening, because life is in the balance here, right? And so we really are running out of time, but it's not necessarily an individual's urgency to short circuit the process of their learning and growth, right? But you teach what you know, and you also teach based upon what you've been sanctioned, right? So for some of your listeners who do have that compelling urge to want to learn to administer medicine, and find yourself a mentor, find yourself an individual whom you respect, whom you can trust, and become teachable, right? Learn how to be humble, right? And as a consequence, you can receive those transmissions, and eventually, over time, perhaps the blessing to be able to, serve medicine or to, conduct ceremony. But it's a process. I mean, in Native cultures, one cannot even regard oneself as a sun dancer until you've completed 16 or 17 years of sun dancing. Okay, so there's cycles that we move through, right? So that for me is the humility piece, right? That you can't even really regard yourself as a sun dancer until you've completed a 16-year plus cycle, right? And that's really what we have to bring is the humility to any sacred path that we're walking, regardless of the tradition. Find oneself a mentor, and not that you surrender your autonomy, which is your sovereignty to make decisions, but rather you have to be willing to give up your authority, right? But you think so you can actually learn what is being transmitted to you, right? And again, we have to come together in solidarity as a species to find pragmatic solutions, for our climate crisis, so that all of the children of the world will be able to survive all of our relations, not just two-legged human beings.
Yeah. Agreed. And I think that there's people out there who have a little bit of maybe a fear, let's just call it a fear or an apprehension of reaching out to people who could be mentors, people who have the experience and the authority and the qualifications to mentor and teach in these ways, probably for a number of different reasons. But I know one of them is because people are afraid that they might be told to scram or, go walk the other way, or this is not for you, when they feel something is really compelling them in that direction. And my experience is when you approach these ways, especially when it comes to mentors and wanting to learn, genuinely learning, when you approach it with reverence, a deep reverence and respect for all of the things that I don't know, patience, willingness to learn, to listen deeply, more deeply than I've ever listened before, and a commitment, a devotion to go beyond and to demonstrate with your actions, with my actions, that I'm willing to go beyond what's comfortable for me in service of this way. Those are the things that, I mean, I'll say just from what I've seen, there's mentors all over that they get giddy over that, because there's also this desire to have a legacy, knowing that nobody's going to be around forever. And these teachings, they do need to go on so that we can negotiate the challenges of the future. And they need to be held with those qualities, like you said: humility, reverence, respect, patience. So I've seen in almost all the cases that when people show up in that way, that there's an openness and a willingness to teach.
Absolutely. I mean, myself included, when I found, or when the path opened up for me to see my mentor, in the native way, my first root medicine teacher, I offered him. I did the traditional offering, which was a wool blanket and tobacco, and I said, I submit to your teachings, and I request to become an apprentice. And it wasn't an immediate yes. He reflected on it. He dreamt on it, and then he got back in touch with me, and he says, yes, the spirits say that it is permissible. And that's when the formal tutelage began. And so, the elders, the medicine people, the chiefs that I know, we're looking for sincerity. We're looking for commitment, right? Because it's an arduous journey, right? There's going to be gateways of fear that you pass through in the beginning. Any spiritual aspirant on any path is going to encounter fear. And that's false evidence appearing real, which are illusions and projections, right? Or F everything and run, which is the other acronym that I prefer. Because there's a tendency to flee. Because all of these medicine paths involve excavation, right? You are the dig site. We're going to actually dive in, and we're going to help to bring to the surface the wounds, fears, traumas, and issues, right? That's really what it means to become a traditional medicine person, is that you work on the aspects of yourself that come from the wounds of your family or from your lineages, right? And that you learn the antidotes, right? You learn how to liberate yourself from the shackles of these wounds, right? And that becomes part of your medicine and your understanding. And it's not an easy journey. And that's the commitment piece that's required, right? Yeah. It's so easy to run, right? When you're confronted with aspects of yourself that really require your love and attention, compassion, and refinement, right? But again, we live in a culture also that's so easy to discard, right? And I see, that actually a phenomenon that I also, we didn't talk about this earlier, but for me, it's very disconcerting, because what I see, we live in a disposable culture, which is also a part of our climate crisis as well, the consumptive aspect of it, right? And consumptive spiritual practices as well, and often the economic stratification in terms of, you have to pay this amount of money, but whereas for us, our indigenous ceremonies, there's no specific charge or fee, right? So everyone's welcome to come and pray, right? But the what can I say about this? I think it's challenging for me because it's what I appreciate about you and about this podcast is that you're willing to have the difficult conversations, right? What I notice in the world is that you don't agree with someone and you discard them, right? And for me, that's just a disposability. Or maybe you have issues with people, and rather than cultivating the courage to embrace the conversation, right? There's this tendency to flee, to discard, maybe text or email, and eliminate them from your life because they're not in accord with you, or you have some kind of disagreement. But the problem is that's also poison, right? That's also toxin. And so what happens is that this continues to percolate in other arenas of your relationships if you don't come to resolution and closure. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have accord, right? We live in a world of diversity. So it's possible to agree to disagree and still understand that everyone has a place on this earth, right? But, in your own personal lives, it's being able to have difficult conversations, right? So that there can be the possibility of understanding and healing, and maybe not necessarily accord or agreement, but at least we can have détente, right? There can be peaceful relations between people. And that peace, to tie it all in here, goes back to how the planet can cool, right? Mm-hmm. Because for me, peacefulness is a way that you remain calm and cool, right? So if the world is more peaceful, right, we don't have these aggressions, these fires, these conflagrations that are happening in the world, right? If things are more peaceful, then there's a possibility of dialogue, possibility of understanding, possibility of respect and love and reverence. And for me, that's the key, coming back to peace within ourselves by also having difficult conversations. So there's the elimination or resolution of conflict.
Agreed. And wow, I really appreciate what you just dropped on us there. I think that's a really appropriate place to leave off for now and put the bookmark back into the pages. Chief Phillip, always an honor to sit with you, and miss being able to sit with you so closely now that I'm here in Texas, but I know we will again soon. Before we wrap it up here, would you just, once again, for people who don't know, direct people where they can get in contact with you if they'd like to learn more?
Thank you very much. Yes, I certainly welcome sincere, committed apprentices and students and clients. So best way to reach me is via phone, actually, because I'm going to be traveling in high ceremonies. Summer is beginning to shift into high season for us. So 415-310-0981. Also email Phillip, Phillip, at ancestralvoice.org. We do have a Facebook page, Ancestral Voice. And probably this summer we will be reconstructing our website, and that's www.ancestralvoice.org. So those are the best ways to reach me. And I would love text and phone. I love the oral tradition. And so, love talking story with people.
Yes. Well, Chief, thank you so much again for bringing your wisdom and giving your time here today. I always enjoy a chance to sit down and speak with you, especially when we get to record it and share it with others. So lots of love to you, and look forward to when we get to do this again.
Likewise, Jetty. It's always a pleasure and an honor, and lots of blessings. And yeah, I miss you and Carrie and the kids. But I pray that Texas is good for you and that you really can flourish and continue to grow.
Yes. Thank you so much.